Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week, the newest variant of COVID-19 is not only a recombination event, but a mutation, and therefore record-setting. Ozempic may be linked to changes in your brain that cause depression amongst others. NHS is going to start testing all children who they think may be trans for autism before proceeding with anything. Lab-grown teeth are ever closer to being put into practice than they have been previously. Trees behave oddly during a solar eclipse. Bed bugs and other insects are being all kinds of creepy crawly. We have TRex leather being claimed as a product of recombinant DNA from dinosaurs, among other products, and researchers experimenting on Reddit users in secret using AI-generated comments. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with COVID-19, although not necessarily as much of a news headline as it was previously. It is still around and it continues to cause various issues. At the moment, the problems are not so much the issues as how the most recent variant came to be. This variant is known as XFL, a rather sci-fi sounding name for what is honestly just a giant pain. What it is the result of 4 recombination events along with a couple of mutations that have led to this final version, and that alone is something of a worry. The first, let's say, 3 versions of recombination were the XEC into the XEK, the XEC 1.8, and XEU from both the XEK and XEC 1.8. This led to the XFL. You then have XEC also mutating into XEC 1.8, which then also recombinated to become XFL. This all sounds rather messy, but the diagram hopefully explains it, with everything on the right side basically being what we're talking about. In terms of protecting yourself from COVID-19, some researchers claimed that which arm you get vaccinated in could have something to say about your immunological response, which this sounds rather far-fetched. Understand, a lot of this is very early research that we're only really now getting a clarification on because it was very much conflicting at the time in question. For example, there was research that said getting an injection in the same arm for both second, third, fourth, and so on vaccinations wouldn't provide any more benefit, whereas getting it in the opposite arm each time would. Now, this most recent research has found that ultimately what you're getting is really not that much improvement from the same arm. However, that improvement, although it's small, does last for a few weeks. So it really doesn't make much difference in the long term. So somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks is the, let's say, the greatest benefit you're going to get after getting your second vaccination shot in the same arm. And that's really all it is. And now for the caveat to all of these claims. The study is very small. So like a lot of things around COVID-19, you need to take it with a lot of skepticism. The simple reality is that having 20 participants get the injection in the same arm 3 weeks apart, and 10 get in the opposite arm, really isn't much of a control group. In fact, it's not much of a study group at all. And therein lies the problem. Drawing this out any further is perhaps overstating the significance of the results. And more so than many people already are saying it gets a better result if you do so, when it's really only a temporary improvement and even then only very minor. Now let's say for the sake of argument that you're someone who is immunocompromised or otherwise susceptible to being infected and having very adverse results to that infection by COVID-19. Well, yes, this might, in theory, provide some benefit. On a somewhat larger scale, in theory again, you could blunt the outbreak, significantly so, by providing a better immunological response in certain vulnerable cohorts who would be infected. But again, this is a very limited study with very limited significance. Even the biopsies of lymph nodes showing a greater percentage of B memory cells within lymph nodes still needs to be taken with significant reticence, given a smaller subset of all participants agreed to this particular aspect of it. So you're taking a larger study, then looking at a very small subset which is relatively self-selecting to say, yeah, this is what happens. In a similar development, we may be seeing the same phenomena with Ozempic and a similar, let's say, a diabetes-type medication generally used with weight loss. The glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonists generally are meant to behave very much like a hormone, and as such, the fact that they have an effect on emotions is not that surprising. There is a reasonably close relationship, to some extent, between hormones and emotion. In this case, the fact that the Ozempic-like products generally play on the brain in a way that makes it think it's actually already been satisfied, and therefore a change in dopamine production occurs. This is why, at least in theory, it's being considered a way of treating things like alcohol and drug addiction, along with obesity and obviously diabetes. But that does come with a major caveat. That caveat being the careful consideration of whether or not, based on the findings of this research, that the use of Ozempic could lead to an increase in depression. Now, whether or not this depression is a result of eating less junk food, such as ice cream, cake, and so on, or actual legitimate changes in the brain, that's yet to be established quite as clearly. But it does appear that way based on some, let's say, broader analyses of trends in government agencies, such as the European Medicines Agency. This does rather invariably raise the question of, is it better to die earlier, in theory, via self-deletion, or, if you don't have that particular problem, survive arguably decades longer because you don't die from, say, a heart attack, stroke, or other similar cardiovascular disease or other complication of being morbidly obese. In much older research now, we need to look at vitamin B1. Vitamin B1 is perhaps more commonly known as thiamine, and there's a hypothesis put forward about 70 years ago in 1958. That is, vitamin B1 is a key player, let's say, in the metabolic process for a molecule structure known as a carbene. Now, carbenes are very unstable and very reactive and break down pretty much straight away once they're in water. Therefore, the theory is that vitamin B1 is essential to their longevity and stability, at least inside the human body, which is for all intents and purposes one giant meat bag surrounding a whole bunch of water. The use of this is kind of important, not so much from a vitamin and nutrition point of view as, well, the body's going to do what the body's going to do. It's why you can't exactly stop cancer, you need to literally kill cancer. Instead, it's going to have greater ramifications and more importance in things like industry and pharmaceuticals. Mostly in terms of, can we replace relatively dangerous, toxic, or otherwise hazardous chemicals in use now with this in order to form those carbenes stably in water and therefore avoid many of the issues that occur on a large scale? The answer for that is probably going to be another 70 years in the making, which does suck, but it is what it is. In news that is revisiting the past, although in this case the very recent past, we have a change in the NHS, or the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. What's going to happen now is that children who are presenting as trans will be screened for autism first, and this does make a lot of sense based on historical evidence of late anyway, and the CAS review. The short story is this. A lot of the children who are going through the trans clinic in the UK, various clinics, were actually autistic and therefore presenting in an atypical manner, and misdiagnosed, for lack of a better word. Because of this, they were being given hormone treatment and in some extreme cases early surgery and similar, which could fundamentally alter their lives and often in adverse ways. By screening these children for autism before giving them a diagnosis of being trans, or gender dysphoria as the proper term is, and then starting treatment down that pathway, there's a better chance they can effectively prevent unnecessary and certainly unwarranted treatment. This is very important as the sheer increase in the number of instances of gender dysphoria amongst children has skyrocketed relative to historical trends, while at the same time we've seen a relative increase in autism diagnoses. The correlation is not necessarily there, but what we do have is a well-established body of literature showing that there's a certain amount of overlap between these two. This is on top of a fairly large raft of other changes that will be required for the trans clinics in places like London and Manchester. It's worth noting that a lot of these changes are actually already in the gold standard recommendations for the assessment of autism and gender dysphoria, so it's not as though this is new things. This is something that should have been done before now, and it wasn't, and does raise certain concerns about how these clinics were operating prior to the review and the change in operation requirements. Shifting now to aging, we have the idea that aging may alter the way certain stem cells operate and instead encourage the development of abdominal or belly fat. Essentially, Is there a reason why you either get, say, a mum bod or a dad bod, or whatever the kids call it now? Now, the research is interesting, but we need to take it with a lot of skepticism because of two things. First of all, the research was based in both mice and human tissue studies, so there's no actual human study here. And unfortunately, or what you find in a petri plate, cell culture or similar, and what you find in an animal model may not necessarily, and often doesn't, translate to a human very well. This is not to say that the molecular pathways and the phenomena observed aren't necessarily true, but they may not work as they're observed in a laboratory setting in a real human body. The other issue to note here is that a lot of what they were doing involved, for all intents and purposes, transplanting cells from one mouse into another mouse in terms of the animal studies, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you can rely on what they're finding. That adds some serious complications to what's going on here. Conversely, adding young mouse cells to old mice didn't seem to have the same effect. So it's not that, again, that there's nothing to this, but there's definitely a lot more to be examined before they reach the conclusion that they do, or at least on a larger scale and apply it to humans. It's something that may very soon be applied to humans, although, again, probably not. It's the idea of growing teeth in the laboratory and then being able to implant it in your mouth and completely replacing missing teeth. Now, this is either a replacement for, say, cavities or damaged teeth altogether, and in some cases just missing teeth if you've been so unlucky. But, and this is a big but here, the nature of the research is, again, animal models, so whether or not it translates to humans, and importantly, whether or not they get approval to do this in humans, is a very different matter. What the researchers have been able to do, and this is more useful, is to create and grow teeth in basically a petri plate. Not quite, but close enough for the purposes of this video. And because of this, they're able to grow them in a completely sterile, controlled environment and make them completely compatible with a human, or in this case, a rodent mouth. The advantage this research has over other research is that we're starting with a scaffold, and this scaffold has a series of releasable, let's say, capsules containing medication within them. The medication contains a signal saying, you need to start growing a tooth and replacing it, here is the environment in which you do so. And by doing this repeatedly but in small doses, it ensures a long-term recovery of the tooth and the tooth's function. Whereas if you do it in one go, the body sort of starts on that pathway, gets halfway through and goes, oh, we're not being told to do this anymore, time to stop, and you get half a tooth, which doesn't really do a lot. Going now to very old news, but evidence that actually supports it. It's a study from 1999 that examined what is the best way to get to sleep, and apparently having warm feet and therefore dilated blood vessels within your feet that lose temperature much quicker allows you to get to sleep sooner. No need for weird cultish hypnotherapies, weird rituals, warm milk, or whatever else it is you happen to do to try and sleep. No, it appears that the best way to be able to do so is to have warm feet, expose them to cool air, and have your feet cool down, allowing for a series of events within your body that eventually lead to the sleep occurring naturally, or at least as close to natural as it gets. With how cold your feet are, you're probably going to be wishing it wasn't. In terms of nature, we have news about trees, and the fact that during a solar eclipse, the forest wakes up, or at least syncs up. We're not going to be seeing Ents marching out to destroy Isengard. What we instead have is trees behaving in a relatively harmonious manner across a large part of Italy, which is interesting. What we're talking about is in the hours leading up to a solar eclipse, according to, let's say, electrical impulse readings, although it's slightly more complicated, the spruce trees in part of Italy, the Dolomites region, would start preparing for the solar eclipse hours beforehand, and then they would respond to the solar eclipse, more or less in harmony. And so, arguably, trees, and in this case plants, are behaving in a way that supports not only a, let's say, collective ecosystem, but a consistent ecosystem. Where this begins to get really weird is that older trees start preparing for the solar eclipse earlier than younger trees, considerably earlier at that, and as such it would indicate that older trees have not only undergone various changes physically, at least physiologically, and structurally, in response to not only seasonal changes, but in response to things like a solar eclipse. Even trees that have been felled, leaving behind little more than a stump, still showed a certain amount of change in response to an eclipse, which would indicate not only are they alive, but they are responding to their environment. In environmental responses, we have chimps, but not responding in the way you might expect. Rather, chimps have been socializing the same way humans have for a very long time, getting drunk together. And yes, in parts of Africa, there have been videos caught of wild chimpanzees sharing fermented fruit, and therefore alcoholic fruit, with each other whilst they get together. This is not quite the level of your uncle coming to Thanksgiving dinner or similar and sharing his political thoughts, but it's along the same lines and could well be the humanity's precursor to this, where your ancient chimp ancestor decided that they'd start talking politics during whatever get-together occurred. Alternatively, the chimps may well have just been sharing the fermented bread fruit to get a buzz, just like humanity does when they go to a bar, pub or similar. Since to some extent chimps don't necessarily share food, at least not as actively as humans might think they do, it would indicate that the direct and somewhat deliberate, if not passive, sharing of alcoholic fruit is a very much intended behavior, and there may be good reason for it, or there may be no reason at all. Shifting to a much smaller scale now, we have bedbugs appearing to be resistant to pesticides as a general rule of thumb. Are those painful things you find in the cheapest of motels hiding under your bed? Yeah, the bedbug. They cause itchiness and are very uncomfortable and obviously a pain to sleep with, if you can sleep at all. Now, there has been many attempts over the years to get rid of them, ranging from basically using cyanide in World War II, or at least before World War II, all the way through to using far more exotic and exciting pesticides. But yeah, the problem is they appear to be getting resistant to just about everything, and we mean everything. The current challenge with this is that although the genes in question are only in an isolated population, at least isolated in terms of the scope of this study, where roughly 134 unique populations of bedbugs were sampled, it's still a worrying figure. A little under 1.5% is still 1.5% more than you want in something that can cause as much trouble as bedbugs do. Going now to other insect news, and we have a particular kind of caterpillar that behaves in the most bizarre way. First of all, it steals dead bugs from spiders, which is a very gutsy choice given that spiders tend to try and nom on caterpillars if given the option. But given the caterpillar's name is the bone collector, we have a feeling that it might be able to manage this somehow. The way this weird caterpillar behaves is somewhat disconcerting, let's call it. What it does is take bits of other insects that are dead and sticks it on its body, and this allows it to sneak by the various spiders that are there. But not only does it dress itself up in the bits and pieces of other dead insects, it's a carnivore and occasionally a cannibal. These are all the signs of something going terribly wrong in Hawaii, other than Hawaii itself being part of America, which could itself be an absolute nightmare. As we mentioned, the whole purpose of dressing itself up in the parts of dead insects is to get by and near the spiders, because the spiders go to all the effort of building up a web and catching insects that are alive, and then these carnivorous caterpillars come along and eat them, stealing all the hard work of said spiders, and ideally not themselves becoming a meal. This almost parasitic scavenging behavior would probably be a very niche and very high-risk strategy for the caterpillars, but it does appear to work. Next we shift to spiders, so close to insects, and the idea of necro-robots and the fact that you can turn dead spiders into, well, not quite dead spiders, through the art of necromancy, and robotics, mostly robotics actually. It's an article we've touched on previously, but in this case it was presented at a conference and, well, as they say in the post, would you let a dead spider controlled by AI robotics perform surgery on your eyeball? At least in theory, and then clarified that no, it's not theoretical, this is something that you can actually do. So, yeah. Just consider this terrifying concept. Not only do you now need to worry about spiders in their own right, but they might come back from the dead and be controlled as a robot. The final sort of animal-related news we have for you is the sort of resurrection of dinosaurs, although weirdly enough, resurrecting dinosaurs turn them into leather and then turn them into a handbag. This is not quite, but getting to the point of being as bad as the idea of resurrecting dinosaurs, only to kill them and turn them into new petroleum products. In this case, it's a biotech startup that's intending to use leather based on the various remains of dinosaurs, but primarily the Tyrannosaurus rex. Again, if we have anything to go by based on Hollywood, that's a terrible idea. Anytime you grow a particular dinosaur for a given purpose, it will find a way to not fit that purpose. Whether it's doing something weird and wonderful, simply breaking free, or whatever it is that happens to be the fashionable concept at that time in particular activist groups. The idea of lab-grown leather by this biotech startup is considered ethically better, somehow. The idea of growing cells specifically to make leather in order to then turn it into a handbag, well, it does seem kind of silly, as oftentimes a leather can be sourced from multiple things that aren't necessarily requiring the same environmental impact. So there's a lot of questions here. The same sort of questions you'd have, say, about something like bio-lab-grown meat or similar. All of these are big issues, and we do have to ask the question of, other than the sheer marketing factor, is there a reason to use TRex leather over any other? After all, we would expect that if it's anything like, say, the predators on Earth, that a predator's leather is not necessarily better than other sources of leather, particularly herbivores in many cases, and not just because, as a general rule, a predator, and a carnivore at that, is quite large, but they're generally not as large as a herbivore. Consider a wolf or a lion to a cow. Oftentimes, the cow is much larger. On top of everything else, the rather glib joke we made earlier about the idea of using, Jurassic Park as an example, isn't actually that far-fetched. The only difference between this biotech startup and Jurassic Park is Jurassic Park used frogs, whereas these researchers are using chickens. So, yeah, we get the very strong feeling that before long, we're going to have a very big problem to do with somehow or other them breaking free and causing problems, whether it's these cells alone or something rather more significant and with greater gravitas. We want to move on now to reiterating a earlier video article or headline, specifically that a particular pattern keeps showing up in certain research, and it is a very specific phrase: vegetative electron microscopy. This is a nonsense term and appears to be driven almost entirely by the idea of using something like Grok, ChatGPT, Gemini, or whatever other quasi-AI system that researchers are using at the time to try and either consolidate research or, on occasion, just make up research. The reason we say this is quite literally that if you take the earliest found research with this particular phrase present, and you simply read from left to right across it as though every line was the same block of text, you see this exact phrase, vegetative electron microscopy. However, if you read the particular text as it is in two columns, suddenly that phrase disappears. So, yeah. The next issue is rather more important. That specific phrase is increasingly showing up in research, and at least a number of articles have been retracted or corrected because they contained it, and specifically because of things like using AI. So these chatbots are creating a problem in science, and they're amplifying the problem in science, because every time an article is published with this error, the AI will pick up on it and go, okay, that's been found again, and it's obviously been published, therefore we're doing the right thing by using it again. So yeah, this is not a good sign. The final bit of research news we have for you is something of a controversy. Researchers from Zurich experimenting on Reddit users. Well, the Reddit users are an experiment, but in this case, they're using a specific kind of experimentation to see if a specific subreddit called the Change My View could actually be, changed by using AI-generated comments. And, they appear to be successful. It toes the line between psychological manipulation of unsuspecting users, and therefore very unethical, and simply exploring what large language models can do. The big sort of catch with the claims that this is manipulation and unethical research is that Strictly speaking, we don't yet know if the entirety of the research wasn't approved by the ethics board at the university. But more importantly than that, the AI was used as a basis, let's say, to respond to a specific prompt from someone else, typically looking for an argument, or in Reddit's terms, a debate, although debates on Reddit generally turn into a pigpen fight where everybody's covered in mud and no one wins. But despite this, they took the original post, the AI response, and then tailored the AI response to whatever the original post was talking about, thereby technically possibly not violating rules in terms of ethics in universities, more so since apparently the article claims that they had ethics approval from their university, which could be a bit of a shaky argument, depending on exactly how this goes along. But more importantly, Reddit moderators claim that they broke their rules, which that is an interesting take to make, given that moderators don't seem to follow their own rules at times, so that's a bit of a pot calling the kettle black scenario. The other reason this may technically be allowable in a weird kind of way is that, certainly in terms of psychology experiments, there is an argument to be made that you can, let's say, retroactively inform people who have been involved in an experiment that they were involved in an experiment if their ignorance of what was going on was a requirement for the experiment to be conducted correctly and effectively. In other words, if you knew about what we were doing before we did it, we wouldn't actually be able to get anything useful from you. On the other hand, if we were to tell you after the fact, it doesn't cause any harm and there's no particular change. Now, Reddit may, and probably does, very much disagree with that particular argument, but it's one of the justifications that can be used in this case. More so since the researchers argue that what they've done allows for the more effective and efficient, let's say, identification and fighting of automated and malicious responses and engagement from things like AI that have been given a script to do certain things. Essentially, is there a way to stop AI from being able to control humanity by manipulating our emotions in many cases? And that's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.